Okay.
Okay, well, good morning, or good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you to this ITIF debate between me, Rob Atkinson, I'm head of ITIF, and my honorable colleague, Tim Wu. I want to turn it over to Lydia DePillis in just a second. I can't think of anybody better to moderate this. She's, I think this is competition policy week for her. She has another panel tomorrow on monopsony. So we should have an interesting debate. We'll end right around 1:30. And I just want to thank Tim. Tim and I have known each other for a long time, and while we don't always agree, we always enjoy disagreeing and have a respectful disagreement. Mm-hmm. So I appreciate Tim taking the time to do this. Not everybody is always willing to engage in debate about their work, so I want to thank Tim for doing that, and then we'll get started with Lydia.
Hi, thanks everyone for being here and for tuning in online. We have a hashtag if you want to tweet about the event. I think it's hashtag ITIF Big Biz with a Z. Want to thank both of you guys, Tim and Robert, for doing this as well. I was saying to Robert earlier that it's so common in DC that we have these like panels of people who agree with each other and they're not very illuminating, but we happen to have two really new books out that are diametrically opposed, and I think an excellent way of digging into these issues. So two of the best minds on either side of this debate. Robert said it's competition policy week. It's competition policy year, really. This has been a big deal for many months now. The FTC hearings are just about to wrap up, looking at these questions anew. So everything is very timely. With that, we'll get started. Just so you know the format, we have 12 minutes for an exposition on each side, and then 8-minute rebuttals. Then we'll have about 30 minutes of questions from me, and then another, I think, 20 minutes of questions from you all. I will try to monitor the hashtag, but we'll see how that goes. So folks in the room probably have an advantage on that front. Okay. With that, I'm going to get to my timer, and we will start with Tim with, ready?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, 12 minutes.
All right. Well, hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. I feel like it is, I'm glad we have a chance to have this discussion. I feel like you stacked the deck by making the cookies so big. Who's going to disagree with big cookies? All right. So the thesis of my book is that the antitrust laws have been under-enforced for the last 20 years. And that we are starting to suffer from the effects of that under-enforcement. In particular, I center on the under-enforcement in terms of merger review and in terms of Section 2 of the Sherman Act, which for people who are not specialists is a part of the act that deals with monopoly. So I think that Rob may contest some of these statistics. We've seen the consequences of, I think, this policy of a much weaker antitrust review in terms of the growing concentration in the economy, sluggish growth overall, and decline in innovation and decline in entrepreneurship. But I also want to talk about some of the particular examples where I think you can sort of look back and see that we have a problem of antitrust enforcement and under-enforcement in particular cases. Let me bring up 3 or 4 cases that I think are evidence of this. And evidence, I guess, that there is such a thing as the curse of bigness, and that not all big is beautiful. If you really do believe that big is beautiful, I would encourage you to look at the merger between Live Nation and Ticketmaster. Live Nation was a near monopoly in live event promoting. Ticketmaster, many of you may know, has a dominant position, if not a monopoly, in ticketing in large venues and in large cities. Since that merger was approved by the Justice Department in the early days of the Obama administration, there have been both increase in the price of tickets, increase in the costs charged or the fees charged by Ticketmaster, the failure of various startups to be able to get into Ticketmaster's market, the death of a few of the more interesting, innovative startups like Songkick, CrowdSurge, have all been destroyed. I would say, therefore, some of the classic signs of a curse of bigness situation, or a monopolized situation, which is a weak innovation, higher prices for consumers, and a failure or a sense of lack of opportunity for entrepreneurs, and therefore what you might call stagnation in that area. Another industry which I think was the where you had mistakes made and undue business is the airline industry. So over the last 10 years, we've allowed a series of mergers that have led to domination of major routes by 3 carriers. Overall, depending how you count, about 4 airlines, including Southwest, about 85% of the industry. The result has been an increase in baggage fees and change fees, coordinated increases in these areas. Many of you probably experienced decreasing seat sizes, the introduction of what I'd suggest are not consumer-friendly innovations like basic economy, which we took the old regular prices and made them lower, and so on. There's also allegations of increased coordination of prices, which is made easier by less competitors. And so this is another example where I think that if you really believe big is beautiful, you have to stare. You might think that you have to stare that tiny airline seat in the face and ask if that's really what you think. If I can talk to the economics behind my argument, I do believe, I'm not a person who doesn't believe in the economics of scale. I do believe that there's obviously efficiencies gained by scale, and that those are important, and that in fact they shouldn't be discouraged. But I also believe that with increasing size, other things start to happen as well. So for one thing, there are at some point, it's hard to know when, depends by industry, scale runs out, and you begin to have disefficiencies of scale, and problems, and often they're dynamic costs, inability of an industry to adjust to change particularly well. Maybe the poster child of this problem is the U.S. car industry from 50s and 60s onwards, where they became big. Were once sort of praised as the model of how an efficient large organization looks. And obviously through the 70s, 80s, 90s, eventually started to recover, but very slow ability to pivot and deal with changes, very slow reaction to Japanese innovation, very little innovation within the industry itself. And I think the car industry in the mid-century is another factor we have to take into consideration if we really want to believe that the big is beautiful. Part of my argument relies on the idea, not only the disefficiencies of scale, but that sometimes size leads advantages that have nothing to do with efficiency. I'm perfectly willing to cede that in a competitive market, if a larger competitor is in fact more efficient, if they have an advantage, well then fine. But what I'm concerned with the big is beautiful thesis is the sense that, or the reality that some of the advantages start to be less about efficiency and more to do with the ability to invest heavily in barriers to entry, either alone or in the case of an oligopoly and sort of a joint barrier to entry, a moat or a joint moat in business school terminology, or increased ability. I know you can test this in your book, but an increased ability for a concentrated industry to invest in governmental barriers to entry in ways of insulating itself from competition from newer, better competitors. And so the concern, and when we speak of a curse of bigness, it's in fact what Brandeis said was not the curse of bigness itself, but the curse of excessive bigness. The problem that at some size, the efficiencies begin to run out, and you begin to run into a set of concerns caused by size in itself. I'd add to this argument that It's often the case that after government breakups or after dissolutions, and I'm curious to hear what Rob has to say, that the industry will perform better. One famous example was after the breakup of Standard Oil. The oil industry actually did a lot better than it did as a single monopoly. So, you know, maybe this is unfair to pin this to Standard Oil on Rob, but at least suggests at a minimum that there are times when the monopoly form in particular will be inefficient and counterproductive, and it might be a very good idea, in fact, to have a breakup. Another example, historic example, very important, I think, for the current economy of the United States is the breakup of AT&T. If you look at telecommunications as a sector in the 60s through 70s, sector that is relatively stagnant, has a lot of innovation in some sense, but not a lot of deployed innovation. You have Bell Labs obviously inventing a lot of stuff, but not actually bringing it to consumers, and in fact blocking AT&T blocking a large number of inventions and innovations because they weren't ready to deploy them yet or thought they might hurt their business model. And after the breakup, telecom and eventually online networking become some of those vibrant sectors in the United States. And ultimately, in turn, on the back of the new service providers, internet service providers that launched in the 90s, you have this thing called the internet economy, which ends up being the mainstay of the current U.S. tech dominance and of much of the sort of the golden goose of the American economy. So if you take the position that you think Bigness is always beautiful, you would have left Standard Oil alone, left AT&T alone. You'd be happy with the way airlines are, be happy with Ticketmaster, you'd be possibly happy with the current state of the pharmaceutical industry, and we'd be living the best of all possible worlds. But I don't think that's even plausibly the case. I think there's a lot of work that remains to be undone, that a lot of mistakes were made over the last 10 years, and that's why my book calls for a reinvigoration of antitrust enforcement, a return to earlier policies which didn't break up every industry, but certainly understood structural relief should not be off the table, and I think a return to some of the policies that we found during the most prosperous, fastest growing periods of history in the United States. So those are my opening remarks.
Are you sure you got 2 more minutes?
No, I'll leave them.
Okay. Generously yields to Robert, who I forgot to introduce these guys. I don't think you guys really need it, but Columbia Law Professor Tim Wu and ITIF President Robert Atkinson. Who's that? You have 12 minutes.
Okay. Well, thank you. First of all, I want to appreciate Tim for his. Some folks, maybe shall we call the neo-Brandeisian side of the argument, tend to sort of put out a lot of straw men, particularly about what we argue in the book, and Tim didn't do that, and I appreciate that. My colleague Mike Lind and I, our co-author, we are not saying at all that all mergers are good, all big firms are good, and big firms never misbehave. We actually talk a little bit in the book about probably too much hospital mergers have gone on. And I don't know about the Ticketmaster case. Sounds reasonable to me. I haven't studied it. So the argument isn't really has the antitrust authorities gotten every single one right. The argument is generally have they gotten it right. And I want to basically start by saying this debate is very emotional. We tend to sort of come at it from our own experience. We've all ridden, and especially me at 6'7". Okay, I have the most pain of anybody when I ride on an airline, so I know what that's about. So we have this sort of emotional feeling, sort of amped up by a lot of articles, and I think really what we need to focus on are what are the actual facts that would either prove or disprove the arguments. And I want to start with airlines. Tim talked about airlines. He says in the book that because of mergers we have worse service and higher prices. I don't think there's any doubt we have worse service. Anybody ever fly Spirit Air? So there's a reason why Spirit Air does well. It's not because they put a gun to people's head. It's because people are willing to put up with really bad service for a really low price. So I don't see why that's a problem. But let's look at airlines just for a minute because it's emblematic of Tim's argument. There's no question that airline have gotten more concentrated. We really have sort of a lead four. But when you look at the BLS data, what you find is from 1997 to 2014, airline productivity went up 4 times faster than U.S. productivity. So they were doing something right, and consolidation enabled some of that productivity go up. What about prices? Well, they have all this market power, so prices should be going up. According to the Bureau of Transportation Statistics, airline prices increased only about half as fast as the rate of inflation over that period. High productivity, low price increases, and the other thing that happened in the industry, those profits that they got, they put them back into CapEx. So you see basically an industry in the midst of a CapEx boom right now, $17.5 billion in new CapEx, airplanes, terminals, and equipment, up from about $6 billion during the early 2000s. So really a tripling of CapEx, a doubling, 4 times faster productivity, and declining prices. What about profits? Really, at the end of the day, this argument falls or rises on profits. Because Tim's assertion and other folks on this side of the argument will argue that concentration leads to excess profits, and that's bad for the average person in society. According to the Bureau of Transportation Statistics, airline profits in the last essentially 4 years averaged 8.8%. And that includes baggage fees, that's everything, all that stuff, fares, everything. Overall profits for the U.S. economy in that period were 11.1%. So you actually had an industry that, and by the way, the airline industry, according to Bloomberg, is the 67th most profitable industry out of 102. So we have an industry that's driving productivity, reducing prices, massively investing in CapEx, and has lower than average productivity. My view of that is what's not to like. The other component here that I think people have missed is when we talk about, Lydia's on a panel on monopsony tomorrow. Another monopsony is the notion of you have buyer power. And there's this view that we've seen, and Tim alludes to this in his book, which I encourage you to read, that we've had rising monopsony, and that leads to lower wage growth. Mm-hmm. In fact, really 2 very interesting studies that have just come out in the last few months. One from economists at Princeton and the Federal Reserve found that while national product market concentration increased a little bit over the last 15 years, that local market concentration actually went down. And this new study by Kevin Rins at the Census Bureau that just came out found that local industrial concentration has been declining. The relevant market, when you go to shop or when you go to buy coffee or when you go to buy a car, that relevant market is the local market. And they found, Rins found, that if concentration had not declined over the last 15 years, that wages would be 1% lower, that earnings essentially would have been 1% higher if concentration had not been decreased. So in other words, concentration led, the deconcentration, I should say, led to 1% higher wages than if concentration had remained the same. Again, exactly the opposite of what a lot of people on the other side will argue. Now, one of the core arguments that Tim's side will use is what is called the C4 or the C8 ratios. In other words, this is Census Bureau data of what share of a particular market does the top 4 firms in the industry have, or the top 8 firms. The latest data from Census is 2012. 17 is not out yet. So just look at 2002 to 2012. What you find was that 59% of industries got more concentrated. This is, I believe, at the 4-digit level. So that sounds pretty bad. It sounds like Tim is right. We got a problem here. But when you, and this is what the next part that the advocates on that side don't point out. The lion's share of those increases went from really small to slightly small. So in other words, if you look at retail, even with Amazon, the C4 in the retail industry went up by 23%. That's a lot, but it went up from 11% to 14%. In other words, the top 4 firms controlled 14% of the market. No antitrust economist will argue that that is anywhere near monopolistic power. So if you look at the 16% of industry, I know there's a lot of numbers, but it's important to get it right. 16% of industries that had a C4 of higher than 40%, not very many of them, only 16% of those industries that grew had a C4 of 40%, and most of those concentration didn't go up beyond 50%. Secondly, if concentration is so bad, if it really has been that the economy has been monopolized, then the single place you should see it is in higher profits. Monopolists want monopoly, not because they like having power, they like having money. Now let's look at profits. If you look at the average corporate profit rate of 2015 to 2016, what you find is it's actually lower than the corporate profit rate in a similar period in 1965 and 66, 13.3 to 13.6. And yet that era is, that period is the golden era of tough antitrust enforcement. DOJ, the famous case, if you're old enough, you remember Buster Brown's shoes. DOJ actually, a very famous case people still talk about, stopped Brown Shoe from merging with Kenny's, another shoe store, because the combined share of that retail behemoth would have been 7% of the shoe market. So you had incredibly tough antitrust competition then, and yet profits today are lower than they were. Secondly, if concentration is so bad, and a lot of the advocates in here point to Europe as having a tough antitrust regime through DG competition, why is it that gross earnings as a share of gross value added, a measure of profits, find that European profits are 40%, again this is gross, you have to go to net to really what shareholders get, compared to 42.5% of the US. In other words, almost no difference. So, Tim talks about not just economic power. How am I doing on time?
You've got 4 more minutes.
Okay, but also political power. And I don't know that I 100% agree with Tim that business political power is a problem. 100% agree with that. But I don't think it's caused by monopoly. Tim, for example, talks about some of the big companies and all, but I have to hearken back to Tip O'Neill, who famously said, all politics is local. So you want to know why, for example, there's a law in every single state that doesn't allow car dealers to sell you a car? It's because car dealers are in every single congressional district, and they have gone and passed laws in every state to make it illegal. I guarantee you, because I've talked to them, Ford, GM, and Chrysler, and I'm sure all the foreign ones, they really want to sell cars directly to you. They don't want to bypass the middleman, or at least they want the freedom to do that. They can't do it because the car dealers are so powerful. Car dealers don't have market power, they have political power. Why is it that one of the biggest buildings for U.S. businesses in Washington is the National Realtors Association down here on New Jersey Avenue? I mean, when you got your own, 7-story building with your name on front of it looking at the Capitol, that suggests you have some juice. NFIB, liquor wholesalers. So I think the argument that somehow big corporations have excess power and all these other forms of business power are not real, I think is misleading. The solution to business power is campaign finance reform. And I think you and I both agree on that, Tim. You might say there are other things too, but campaign finance reform. Tim says that we have inequality and wage stagnation because of this. Again, all the evidence, most of the studies show that the relationship between increased concentration and inequality is negative. Actually, you get less of it. That's because big corporations tend to have higher wages. I would encourage you to look at Bob Samuelson's piece yesterday in the Washington Post that found and actually got Thomas Piketty to finally acknowledge that Piketty's second study that showed that real wages went up 33%, not down 8%, is the right study. So I think that's a little bit of a myth. And two last things. Tim, I think, ignores the significant benefits of size. We found in our book that workers in large firms earn on an average 54% more than workers in smaller firms. They get 85% more overtime, 2.5% paid leave and insurance, 3.9 times more retirement benefits. The 4 largest firms in any industry average 37% higher productivity. So there's something about scale. I'll just close by saying that a lot of what this is about is trying to grapple with serious problems in the U.S. economy. The U.S. economy has not performed in the last 10 or perhaps even 20 years the way we would like it to perform. Wages haven't grown enough, all these other things. I don't think this is the area. I think we need to be thinking about things like a higher minimum wage, a national innovation policy, and other things, and not really be focused on breaking up companies that are oftentimes the engine of innovation. So, thank you.
All right. Well, why don't we focus on what we, and what do I have, 8 minutes?
8 minutes.
We can focus on what we agree upon, which is I do agree hospital mergers have gotten out of hand, and that's been a serious problem. And I don't want to caricature your position, but let's take up something that I think is important, which you address in your book and also in the title of this organization, which is the matter of innovation. You know, there's a long-standing debate as to how innovation happens, and I don't want to. And I think most people agree that it happens both through, big labs, big firm innovation, and also through the efforts of startups and other, basically startups or new thinkers or branches off that try new ideas. And I want to suggest, my book is primarily about antitrust enforcement, and one of the things I want to suggest is that antitrust enforcement has had a big role in sparking some of the most important innovation cycles in the United States over the last 40 or 50 years, and say that therefore we're in danger if we don't take seriously our the degree to which we let antitrust enforcement go down, that we'll lose some of this. And it goes to some of the concerns we both share about the United States economy underperforming. So three cases I want to defend in this particular respect are the case against IBM, the case against AT&T, and the case against Microsoft. So all of these were, in some ways, avowedly anti-bigness cases. They selected the largest firm in the industry. They targeted them with federal litigation. They're sort of the essence of an anti-bigness plan. These lawsuits were all heavily criticized in their time. Probably IBM the most, since it went on for 13 years and didn't produce a clear verdict, but AT&T as well and Microsoft as well. Many people said, borrowing some of the arguments that you have presented here, that these were big, innovative firms, that they maintained important laboratories, they paid their workers well. They were the backbone of the U.S. economy and therefore should be left alone, not targeted for breakup. But I think if you look carefully at the tech history of the last 50 years, you'd have to conclude these were important cases in that history, and let me go through them. So IBM, as many people here know, was the monopolist of mainframes and computing monopolist in the United States by the 60s. They had some challengers, but they had a monopoly, and a lot of this was due to their, I'll give credit to IBM, they had some great inventions, System 630 and some other technologies. Nonetheless, they were investigated for a variety of conduct, including vaporware and also tying of their software to their hardware product. So the antitrust case against IBM went on for a long time and can be criticized for how it was handled, but it did have some important consequences, I think very important consequences. One was that IBM, almost at the beginning of the lawsuit, abandoned the practice of tying hardware and software, and therefore you had the beginnings of an independent software industry, and even IBM historians will credit that moment as a decisive moment in the birth of an independent software industry, and I think it shows some of the danger it shows some of one of the classic costs of bigness, which is too much decisional authority and too few actors. In an area like innovation can be dangerous in the sense that if you sort of make the wrong decision, you feel that software and hardware should be tied forever, you can have a significant effect on the economy. At its worst, this was one of Hayek's criticisms of monopoly, or of centralized planning in general, is that it creates an informational problem for any single actor, because no one has enough information to be able to know what the future will be like, what the right decisions are, hence the advantage of decentralized systems. So you had a birth of a software industry. You also had, during that period when IBM was under investigation, the birth of the PC industry, originally through sort of hobbyist toys like the Apple Computer 1, but and the Commodore PET and other products, but eventually becoming, actually IBM came back into the industry, but very importantly came in under antitrust scrutiny and was never able to monopolize the IBM PC market, built the computer in a way that left it very susceptible to copying and competition, and ultimately yielded this incredible computer boom of the 1980s. I submit that you would not have had the leadership of the United States in computing had we left Big Blue undisturbed, had we allowed the mainframe paradigm to continue to dominate, and that antitrust played an important role in that. So that's one industry. The AT&T case I already referred to, but I think that AT&T showed many of the hallmarks, some of the weaknesses of bigness and centralized planning. They had sort of decided that they knew how the American telecom system was going to proceed. They had an orderly plan. It did not include things like packet switching, did not include things like modems in consumer hands, did not include things like fax machines. It was like, here's how things are going to be. And that sort of centralized technological leadership, in retrospect, I think might have been suitable for certain periods. It was dangerous over the long term for the healthy United States. So I spoke to that sooner, and I think that any defense of bigness has to deal with this problem of centralized technological leadership as opposed to decentralized and multiple ideas going at the same problem. So obviously internet economy follows the breakup of AT&T, and I think ends up being very significant. Microsoft is the last of the big three that I think are very important. Microsoft had monopolized the operating system market, was going after the browser market, in fact succeeded in monopolizing browsers, and I think it would have been very challenging for the next generation, Google, Facebook, Amazon, today's giants, to even get started in a world where they were in an unpoliced browser controlled by Microsoft. And so I think the sort of second wave of the internet boom after the 2000s further has, I'm not going to say antitrust has everything to do with it, but it had a lot to do with it by getting Microsoft out of the way. So there's this crucial role in disciplining big firms, and they have this, as I said, something that has to be accounted for in any claim that big is beautiful, this danger of overly centralized economic planning centered in just a few errors, given the capacity for human fallibility, given that people make mistakes. Decentralized systems have advantages, and decentralized systems are not are smaller.
30 seconds?
That's it.
Okay. All right. 8 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So Tim raises, perhaps the most central point, certainly for us, because our innovation is in our DNA and in our name. You want an economic system that is structured in a way that's going to maximize innovation. It's one of the most important performance characteristics of an economy. And yet there's two very different competing theories and frameworks among economists. You have Schumpeter's framework, and a little bit also William Baumol that we talk about in the book, that innovation requires some level of what Schumpeter calls supernormal profits. If you read the new book on biography of Gordon Moore, I encourage you to read, just came out this summer, fantastic 800-page book. You realize that Intel, when you read that book, every time, at least in their early 20 years, they were betting the farm. They were taking all the profits they made and they were betting the farm on the next big thing. And thankfully for them and us, it worked. But without those supernormal profits, Intel would be like a dry cleaning industry. No profits, no innovation. Kenneth Arrow's on the other side. Kenneth Arrow says it's competition that motivates people. It's the lash that gets everybody motivated. And there's some very good evidence by Phil Aghion and others, economists at Harvard, that innovation is around the optimal structure is an inverted U. You don't want too much monopoly. You don't want too much dry cleaning atomization. I don't know whether Tim agrees with that or not, but if he does, then the real question is, with any particular industry or firm, where are we on that U? The second point is, in many of these cases that Tim talks about, you don't need a structural remedy, you need a conduct remedy. You didn't need to break up IBM, all you needed to do was ban tying. You didn't need to break up Microsoft, all you needed to do, as the Justice Department did, was to require them to have an open interface so that software developers could build for Windows. That solved 95% of the problems. And yet, though, when you look at what we've done in the past, there have been an enormous number of mistakes that people don't talk about. In the U.S. in the 1950s, I don't think anybody knows. It's this history that we were able to uncover that nobody knows, seems like it. The U.S. government, Justice Department, forced U.S. companies to give away, largely for free, no cost, 50,000 patents to competitors. One of these companies was RCA. Anybody remember RCA? The Radio Corporation of America. In the 50s, it was the largest and most successful color television firm in the world. There was a good study by somebody at Rensselaer Polytechnic, studied this, and he found that the RCA monopoly increased prices by about 2.5% for TV sets, but that the RCA innovation was so great that it spilled over to all the other TV makers, and it let them be much, much more cost effective, so the net benefit to consumers was great. So what happened in the RCA story? They forced them to give away their patents to U.S. companies. And by the way, RCA was always licensing their patents because they wanted the money, so they would license to competitors all the time. It forced them to license to a bunch of companies from a country called Japan. And without that, the Japanese television industry would never have gotten off the ground. You want to know why the U.S. doesn't make televisions anymore? Or at least maybe at some point we would have stopped. But why we lost them so quickly is because we forced RCA to give their core secrets to the Japanese. That's why Sarnoff was awarded them some Star of Japan award by the Chinese government. We did the same thing with Xerox. FTC took a case against Xerox and said they had to not only give their patents, but their drawings, their blueprints, they had to give them to every single firm. And guess who got them? Ricoh, and all the Japanese copiers. That's how the Japanese copier got how they got their technology. So this was a whole legacy of basically de-industrializing, de-innovating the U.S. economy. And one can make a case that we did it with AT&T. AT&T, because of Bell Labs, they were, and by the way, somewhat of this pressure was good in the sense they were, they licensed out the transistor to firms like Texas Instruments. But they also had the licensing fees super, super low because of this antitrust concern. They were worried that if their licensing fees reflected real value, the justice would come after them. So guess who got one of the most important licenses? Sony. Sony, if you remember Japan in the 50s, they had no money, they had no Forex, they couldn't do it. The best they could cobble together was $50,000. For $50,000, that got Sony into the game. Without that, Sony wouldn't have been in the game. So these are all situations where I think we've made, fairly serious mistakes. Lastly, I would argue, again, I go back to this point, I think that Tim, is confusing conduct with structure. On AT&T, we could have done a conduct remedy. We could have done essentially what's called Carter phone for lots and lots of things. You can hook up any device you want to the network. We were already getting competition with MCI. I don't think we had to break up AT&T. One of the things that we got from the breakup of AT&T was essentially the U.S. having no, more or less, telecommunications equipment industry. Western Electric, which became Lucent, was the dominant telecommunications equipment firm in the world. Bell Labs was the most important lab in the world, and both are gone. There's a new study, if you haven't seen it, in the Washington Post last week, 2 weeks ago, I think, in the Sunday paper, and it was a very interesting study by these economists that looked at patents. They used AI to understand patents back from 1830, and I don't know what algorithm they used, but somehow being able to find the most important patents. The two firms in American history that have filed the most important patents, IBM and AT&T. I don't think we can sneeze at that and say, oh, well, this stuff's going to happen. And good. So again, I'm not saying that antitrust authorities should turn a blind eye to anti-competitive behavior. And to be sure, many, many large technology companies have engaged in anti-competitive behavior. They're not supposed to. That's a big role of government to stop them. But breaking up and doing structural remedies, I think, is very, very different. By the way, on the Microsoft case, if you haven't listened to a great podcast I listened to called Business Wars by Wondery, and the latest one is Netscape versus Explorer, Netscape versus Microsoft. And most of that war occurred before there was a case with Microsoft. So I don't know that case really limited. I think it was Microsoft's inability. If you read at the time, you remember Netscape was a vastly superior technology, and eventually just like it's one of those things where say, who cares about browsers? I don't pay for my browser. It's a commodity. Doesn't really matter. And last point I'll make is on startups, because clearly you want an economy where your incumbents are globally competitive and able to fight. By the way, the most important fight we're ever going to face in U.S. competitiveness is with the Chinese. And I tell you, they have scale. Their antitrust authorities aren't having this conversation. In their conversation, how do we get firms to come together to get scale and power? But when you look at high-tech startups, according to Scott Stern at MIT, we have the second highest rate of high-growth entrepreneurship in 2014. In other words, high-tech startups, second highest rate. The study we did, where we examined 5 million startup firms in 10 technology industries, we found that in 2016 it was 30% higher than in 2006. Very little evidence, in fact no evidence, to show that our current economy, how it's structured, is not generating a robust amount of high-tech startups.
Great. So I saw Tim scribbling over here furiously when we started talking about structural remedies versus regulating big firms. So I wanted to give you a chance to address why not just tell companies they can't do certain things.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think because they don't work. I think that we've been experimenting with conduct remedies for the last 10 or 20 years, and conduct remedies, they're very appealing and intellectual on an intellectual level. They're ideally, as someone who worked in law enforcement and hung out with a lot of economists, you can kind of craft this very ingenious conduct remedy which will, solve this competitive problem but not have the messiness of a breakup. But I think that the track record is very mixed to poor for conduct remedies and their success. There are some, I'll grant there's some success. I think the Microsoft sort of probation was successful. There was not a breakup. There was a probation. Although I think you're underrating the browser as a potential control point for competition and a potential source of barriers to entry. Just to stick on this for a second. If you imagine the year 2002 and Google had started to become successful, and you had a monopoly browser and no oversight at all, why would Microsoft ever let Google be the default or let it load as quickly? Or, why wouldn't it do exactly what it had done to Netscape, which was make sure it lost, or what it did to WordPerfect, what it did to Lotus 123? I mean, it had a strategy, and it had been very successful in making its own products win. And I think we'd all be using Bing right now. And you could argue that would be fine, but I think we would have lost something along the way. But yeah, so I don't think they've been successful conduct remedies. But typically, as I said, they're negotiated by very talented attorneys and economists, and then they end up in a filing cabinet somewhere, or some enforcement part of the agency is supposed to deal with them. Sometimes they're even forgotten. When I worked in the White House, we started looking into the beer industry, which merged to monopoly in Europe. The Europeans get a undue credit for their antitrust policies, because I think they are frankly too much into these conduct remedies. They allowed a merger to monopoly with conditions in the beer industry. And the point of this is that there was so many consent decrees covering the beer industry, people had lost track of them. It wasn't clear they were having any effect. And so I don't think they're effective. I think structural remedies are much more effective. And it gets to this political point, which I've been emphasizing, and I don't mean small barrel politics like here are my friends or enemy. I think that one of the reasons for breaking up AT&T, one of the arguments, was that they had become sufficiently powerful politically, and you said that, that they were essentially immune to the FCC's regulation efforts. One of the reasons, if you get into the history, that the Antitrust Division brought the case was the sense they weren't listening to the FCC at all. The FCC had mandated attachments, had done the things you were talking about, Carterphone and long distance, and AT&T was happy to sabotage MCI and other firms that were trying to make a start, because they didn't really fear regulation, didn't fear the consent decrees. But the political calculus in telecom changed a lot after the breakup. And I think you had a moment, actually, where some of the better telecom policy was designed when you had a balance of power between the Bell systems and AT&T and long distance, where they were sort of fighting it out for a while before they remerged. So I think we have to be sensitive to the ability of companies, and I think you are sensitive to this, to almost become part of the state and therefore immunize themselves from competition and lead to long-term stagnation. And, there's countries, I don't have as many statistics at my fingertips as you do, but I sense that, in countries like Mexico, even in Japan, where they never broke up NTT, you have this the problem I'm talking about, a really inability for the startup industries to get started in these areas. And one of the reasons I think the United States ended up beating off Japan, despite giving a lot of these patents you were talking about, is a better antitrust policy. Is that we broke up telecom, as I said, broke up some IBM and allowed a lot more room for smaller companies to grow. And those smaller companies became the new generation of giants. Well, Japan, it still is NEC and NTT. Since they've had the same companies there 50 years, they were too much into big is beautiful and have sank as a result.
So, I think the way to think about this debate is Tim's right. There are risks of sort of too little focus on enforcement and even structural. There are risks to that. But I would argue there are type 2 errors as well of going too far the other way, which I tried to allude to. The other risk here is, I think, is and by the way, the beer industry to me, I don't really care. So I enjoy my yuppie craft brewed beer that I get at Rodman's, and the last time I bought Budweiser was probably on some airplane where that's all they had. We do have a pretty robust, innovative beer sector, I have to say that.
Might still be owned by Budweiser.
Most of them aren't, actually. There's only one owned by Budweiser, I believe. But
craft brews?
Goose. Is it Goose Island or something? Well, whatever.
Yeah, Goose
We
Island.
can talk about beer. I'm happy to get into beer.
Sorry to
But
interrupt.
the point of one is the other risk here is that the government is thinking about technology as if it's locked in amber. And a very famous case, which Tim, you cite in your book, and we cite in our book, and I'm going to get it wrong, Lieberman, and New Ice in Oklahoma. Is that
Right.
something like that? And it was this case where it was actually the case that Brandeis used. I didn't realize this until I read your book, Tim. It was the case he used to talk about the importance of laboratories of democracy. So what was the case? It was a company that had a monopoly on carving ice out in the wintertime in Oklahoma and sticking it in these ice freezers and selling it to people for their ice chests. Well, I don't think we had to worry too much about that, because within 4 or 5 years you had the sale of refrigerators. And so it was one of those cases where, sure, if we were never going to get innovation in the ice industry, then Liebman or whatever it was called was a monopoly, and there was a problem there. But it was one of those things where Schumpeterian creative destruction made the point moot. And I think the same is true, although certainly with a little bit of a lag with AT&T. At fundamental level, does anybody really care what happened to long distance? When was the last time I made a circuit switch long distance call other than on my cell phone? I use WhatsApp. I use chat. There's no more long distance. There's no more monopoly in it. So so the point is moot. And then with browsers, there's 4 different browsers that I have loaded on my machine, and I use some for one and this and that, or and there's 3, and then my iPhone. Again, I don't see what the problem is in the browser market. It was one of those things that just kind of emerged.
We had the case.
Pardon?
Well, anyway, we did have the antitrust case. I mean,
I guess my point is, I don't think that. First of all, I don't care. I mean, I have one browser; it doesn't really matter to me. It's just this piece of software that gets me what I want to do. Where I worry about innovation and competition is once I get someplace on the internet, whether it's Amazon or some other place. And so and then you mentioned that I'm less sure. Maybe in Europe the consent decrees on beer are super complicated. I don't know. I haven't studied that, but I just think we have to think about innovation industries differently. They're not beer. They're fundamentally different in the sense of you have to have Schumpeterian profits to keep innovating. Scale really, really does matter, because in those industries you have very low marginal cost, high fixed cost. Look at Intel. For them to come out with the next generation of chip, they don't just they don't just sort of, oh, let's do that. It's an enormous set of investments, an enormous amount of money, and if they can't have some confidence that they can do that, and yet if you look at, use a counter example, Tim, and then I'll stop. You look at semiconductor innovation, which you have to argue is probably the case where innovation has been better than any other industry in the world. Semiconductors. And, pretty clear we've had a monopoly on that. Intel, you got AMD. The only reason AMD got a share was because there was a consent decree to force them to give Intel some rules there. But Intel's dominant, and yet they continued to innovate and innovate. And the reason they innovated wasn't because they were worried about a competitor, let's say, although ARM now is a very strong competitor to Intel. It's that they wanted to keep selling these things, and they knew that if they could come out with the next generation, they'd make a whole lot of money.
Do you have anything more to say on that?
Sure. I mean, I wouldn't mind talking about innovation because I think it's a good topic to get into. I'm a little worried we'll agree, but so I'll try to be a little more aggressive. No, I'm going to try to be a little more aggressive on this because I think you are. You in the book accuse people of overselling startup innovation as like the only way, and you talk a lot about big firm innovation. But I think you're overselling big firm innovation in the sense that I'm not saying it doesn't matter. I think that there's an important history of corporate laboratories doing important basic research. But I want to get back to this sort of cognitive problems that I think big centralized companies have in the deployment of innovation. I think this is a recurrent if you study carefully the history of the United States, now I'm going to my first book, The Master Switch, you have recurrent cognitive problems in large established companies and industries actually deploying innovations and thinking about certain innovations they might want to do. And so there's a number of examples of this. I don't want to stick AT&T we've talked about already almost to death, but as you well know, there was a number of technologies that they themselves invented and were unwilling to deploy. They had an answering machine in 1936, for example, in Bell Labs, but they decided it wasn't suitable for consumer usage. They were afraid that taped conversations might lead people to abandon the telephone altogether. They did an internal survey that determined that certain percentage of telephone conversations were obscene, and they thought people would just give up on the telephone altogether, so they never deployed the answering machine. Western Telegraph, to come back to when Bell was a tiny company, was concerned. Western Union, was concerned about the rise of the telephone. Wanted it to be an adjunct to the telegraph system. You would have a telephone in your house that would ring to tell you that a telegram had come, or something like that. And there's a real danger. I think there's, you talk about Schumpeter. There's really two Schumpeters. He's one guy, but he had different phases. And he had a phase, as you discuss in the book in more detail, where he had decided in the 1940s and 50s that corporate research laboratories were where it was, and all the money was there, and that was how research was done. But there was also the earlier Schumpeter who spoke about entrepreneurs as, and you actually mentioned this, as sort of unusual, risk-taking people who try things that no one else has tried before and are not afraid of failure the way normal people are. And I think that gets to the central cognitive issue that there will be, and history suggests, that people slightly outside the mainstream have brought some of the most important disruptive innovations. The tendency is for large firm innovation to be a little more incremental, like Intel, and that's an important form of it gets sort of faster. The chip gets faster and faster and faster and faster, but it's not something that's replacing the chip altogether. And I'm not saying it's not important innovation, but I'm saying the kind of disruptive innovation, which actually is Bell at its early days, or when it invented the telephone, or the invention of radio, or the invention of the internet itself, really came from a different cognitive direction. Mostly were launched by, it's not mythology, some of these really were in garages, and there's not like it's not like every innovation, but it has been the American the story of American innovation policy has had a lot to do with these outsiders who upend an entire industry and provoke massive amounts of growth. So I think you overly discount that cycle.
We could go back and forth on this a lot, but I know you guys are innovation super wonks, and I just want to try to get to some other subjects.
Can I just have a quick response?
Sure.
Yeah.
So, what's interesting, I think, about when we did the book is there's a new data set from the National Science Foundation, which really is new, and for the first time it went in and asked firms a whole set of real serious questions about what are you doing in innovation, not just how much money do you spend on R&D. And some really good economists who I've communicated with, and I'm blanking on their name, but it's in the book. I think one is at University of Michigan. They dug through that data set very, very deeply, and what they found was that, counter to the myth that small firms are more innovative, even in radical innovations, that large firms are actually as innovative, if not more, and the reason is they engage in what's called innovation spreading. So one discovery in one little firm leads to one innovation. That same discovery in a big firm leads to 3 innovations. So that's point number one. Point number two is 100% agree with you, Tim. I mean, again, as we say in the book, it's easy to parody our book, and I know you're not doing that. Big is good and small is bad. What we're really saying in the book is you have to have a healthy ecosystem of bigs, smalls, mediums, and startups, and that policy of a wide variety of forms has to enable that. Lastly, on AT&T, to my way of thinking, any company that develops wireless, the transistor, and Claude Shannon, inventor of network theory, anything else they messed up or restricted, it just, to me, the gains are so great from those 3 things. And there's many, many, many more things. If you read the biography, the history of Bell Labs, it just came out, that's his name, a great book on Bell Labs 3 or 4 years ago. You see that. And the last point is on scale. I read a book recently and reviewed it for a publication called Never Lost Again, and it's a very interesting book by this guy who was an early startup founder, and the CEO ended up going up to found Nuantic Labs, which made Pokemon Go, because he got tired. He died of it. But what his company did was, for the first time, and it's to your point, Tim, they figured out a way to take NASA data, put it in a web browser, and so you could scan up and scan down, and it renders perfectly. And the monopoly, there was a monopoly they were fighting. There was a company, there was one company that had all the mapping. So if you're a real estate agent, you had to buy from them, $250 a year. This company comes along, gets some startup capital, and it makes this incredible innovation. Completely disrupted the monopoly, and they happen to be located, the startup, called 2 blocks from Google, when Google was a youngish company. They started talking to him and talked to Sergey Brin, and they said, hey, why don't you want to buy our company? So they had thought, because this was very, very resource intensive to go out and map every street, go with the airplane. They actually hired some guy in Texas to fly airplanes so they could build their database. They thought it would take them 20 years to map the United States. And Sergey Brin said, I think it's a great idea. I'm going to put $1 billion or $2 billion, some enormous amount of money into this. We're going to map it within 2 years. And they did. And they put that other company out of business because this is now called Google Maps. It's free. And so, yeah, I get the notion, Tim, that sometimes, again, it can go too far, but there are lots of other cases in that bucket which we don't talk about enough.
Urgent rebuttals? Okay, great. So I want to bring us into a really relevant example right now, which is Amazon, which y'all have mentioned a couple times in passing. But there's sort of this disagreement about whether that's an example of monopoly power run amok or this platform that empowers lots of small businesses to reach an audience that might be halfway across the world. So how does Amazon fit into both of your arguments about bigness and antitrust and what to do about it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Amazon is a puzzle. I mean, my book is mainly about antitrust, as people know by now. And Amazon presents a challenging puzzle for the antitrust laws. And if you haven't noticed, there's been no action on Amazon. I think that the main concern that people have. I think there's several concerns that people have with Amazon, and maybe I'll discuss them. So one is the sense that if Amazon ends up, becoming the dominant and indeed the monopoly site. It's not quite there yet, so this is perhaps premature. But if if they become the monopoly of online commerce, so if there's no real competing sites, and they're not quite there yet, they still have competition from Walmart and Target and a few other online sites, but they're at over 50%. You then first of all, you have to ask what they did along the way to get there, and whether they did anything that was inappropriate in defeating their competitors, or whether they defeated them fair and square. But then I think you also start to gain concerns, if that monopoly lasts, about the platform and its effect on the rest of the economy. This is why I think that the marketplace, people have concerns about the conditions of competition in the marketplace. So the marketplace has the potential, sort of ideally to be a place that promises what e-commerce had always promised, which is like, you come up with a better mousetrap, you live in a remote part of the country, nonetheless, you're able to gain attention for this mousetrap and sell it online, even in a way you couldn't before. Maybe before you could do by mail order or whatever. So that would be the ideal. But I think the concern is whether Amazon is going to run its platform that way. We're going to start. This gets more into telecom policy, and whether it needs to be understood more in term, or whether Amazon will, almost like Microsoft did in the old days, sit around, figure out which are the most successful products, copy them, and then take the additional revenue. And worse than that, to make the search, which obviously has control over, something where you don't get really a fair shake at what you're looking at. I think of that, if you have strong evidence that this is the problem, I think you start to have a case for a style of common carrier or net neutrality or type of regulation, which is designed to protect this what has become a principal channel of commerce. Because I feel like I hope retail, regular brick and mortar retail survives. I kind of like having downtowns, but if they don't, this now we're talking about this being the only channel for retail, the only place people get their start, and to have that a situation where it's very difficult, unfair kind of starts to have an effect on the entire economy. And so the argument starts becoming a little bit like the neutrality argument, which is if you have something that feels like infrastructure, feels essential to commerce, but is biased or uneven, how great are the effects of that on the rest of the economy? So I think that's one concern with Amazon. I can go maybe on with it, but yeah. So maybe I'll leave it there.
So I think we have to remember here the world before Amazon, which was a nightmare. You actually had to leave your house and drive up Rockville Pike in Montgomery County and face terrible, terrible traffic. So I'm struck by an Obama Council of Economic Advisors report that came out right before the administration ended their term. And the report said, quote, allowing firms to exercise the market power they have acquired legitimately, and I stress that's the key point, can maintain incentives for research and development, new product innovation, productivity gains, and entry into new markets, all of which promote long-term economic growth. Amazon is the poster boy of that process. If you look at the most recent study, most recent data on global R&D by corporations, the firm that invests more than any other corporation in the world in R&D is Amazon. I want that to happen. They're investing in drones. They're investing in automated warehouses. They're investing in a whole slew of things that are going to make our lives better if those things come to pass. Secondly, I don't think any antitrust economist would define the relevant market as online. You don't go, well, I'm buying online and then I'm doing it. It's the retail market. And when you look at that, again, the last I looked was about 4 months ago, Amazon was not even in the top 4 retailers in the U.S. So they don't have market power now, I would argue. It's possible they could get there if people love them so much, although I could be wrong on this. I thought I saw that Walmart had actually gained online market share there. I would agree with Tim to some extent. At one level, it is their platform. They have made it so much easier for small firms to get on a much broader platform and sell much more than they ever have before, partly through just being able to have visibility and also being able to use the Amazon logistics. But I agree that that could be a problem if they behaved unfairly. And so I don't I wouldn't argue for, cell neutrality. There may be companies on there that frankly shouldn't be selling. I mean, there's a reason why you have a closed ecosystem on the Apple iStore, because they don't want bad actors being in the App Store. I think Amazon has the same right to say we don't want certain sellers in here because we think they're degrading the platform. These platforms are two-sided markets, by the way. They're degrading the platform. People are going to go to Walmart platform where they can trust the seller. So I don't think we can say that they can't do anything. I think what we have to say is, are cases where they're kicking somebody off the platform or degrading somebody, and are they doing it for anti-competitive reasons, or are they doing it for legitimate reasons? And they shouldn't be allowed to do it for anti-competitive reasons. I think Tim and I would agree with that.
Well, let me give you an example of the Amazon kicking off Apple refurbishers and resellers because it could now sell all of Apple's products. That's I think, the more concerning example.
No, I have not looked at that case, and I'd have to look at that case. I guess I would I guess I'd stand with my point, which is the scrutiny should be, if there's no legitimate reason to do that, then that might be suspect. I just don't know in that case. I haven't studied it.
Can I bring up something? Can I go back to something he said? This is really a question for Robert. I was a little surprised, and I'm trying to figure out whether your appreciation for bigness is also a sort of nationalistic policy. So you discussed the idea that RCA and Xerox, maybe were asked to give their patents away, and this benefited a series of Japanese competitors. So a certain kind of economist would say, well, Sony and RCA was a oversized, I would say inefficiently oversized corporation with a lot of management problems, and Sony was a more fleet-footed competitor that gave consumers what they want. Seemed like people like Sony products quite a bit. The Walkman, I don't know if people here remember the Walkman and things like that. So, Xerox also showed signs of stagnation and decay despite its earlier prominence in photocopiers. They obviously, talking about big firm innovation, didn't invent a lot of important personal computer technology, utterly failed to deploy it in a way that people would actually buy. And so, they were ripe for disruption, and in fact were disrupted, but as you point out, by many foreign companies. So is it your view, which seems to me unusual for an economist, maybe not unusual in Washington, that respect for bigness includes protecting big American corporations against foreign competition because they're American, or is it something different that you're suggesting in the story of the American companies, electronic companies that lost out to Japanese competitors?
Oh, I'm definitely saying that. And there's no question that neoclassical economists who dominate the debate ignore nationality. Their view is that somehow the Japanese had comparative advantage somehow in televisions, and we didn't. And you look at Alan Blinder, when Alan Blinder, after that decision, by the way, and by the way, the other thing the Japanese did, and this is very clear, they did this, they dumped televisions, they sold them above cost, way above cost in Japan, dumped them into our market to drive RCA and other companies out of business. That's without a fact. But Alan Blinder said, well, this is a case of success. We lost our television industry. It's a case of success because we weren't meant to be in television. Now, my view is there are lots of things we probably aren't meant to be in, and I don't want to hold on to every single thing, but I'd like that to be decided by natural market forces at the base, although not to say that you can't have an innovation policy. So the only other point I'll make, Tim, to your point about Xerox kind of missing it, the famous case of Steve Jobs going into Xerox PARC. That was after the antitrust case, not before. RCA losing its way. I mean, man, they got into all sorts of bizarre things they bought, like I think Western's menswear or something like that. Again, that was all after they lost their capability. The studies of RCA, and again in the 50s, and were that they were the most innovative electronics company in the world. They were providing consumers with the best innovations. So I think a lot of that actually happened afterwards when they were struggling.
Well, you'd have to give Zenith some credit, but let me try and pin you down now, because I think if you do believe that, which that they're it's important to in some cases protect American industry against attack from foreign competitors and so forth. Why then, in your book, are you not tolerant of the same efforts in the name of localism? In other words, a lot of the things you've attacked in your book, neo-Brandeisian programs, are actually efforts by local communities or states to try to protect, their regions from national forces and what they consider to be foreign competitors. So it seems to me I detect an inconsistency, I suppose, between your desire to sort of say the United States can protect its own, but to say regions can't protect their own if they want to in a democracy.
So I think that's a good point, Tim. I think two major important distinctions. One is a lot of what we're arguing about is don't make it worse. The government shouldn't make it worse, as they did with Xerox, IBM, AT&T, RCA, Kodak. They made it worse. They artificially gave our competitors a leg up. There's no need to do that. Secondly, when other countries violate the terms of the WTO, like massive dumping or intellectual property theft, as the Chinese are doing now to harm our companies, absolutely we should take steps. So I don't see that as really sort of somehow, to me that's about letting market forces play out. A lot of what we talk about at the local level are basically not letting market forces play out. Bans on Walmart. Let these things work out for the benefit of the consumers in a community. And the last point I'll make is there's a reason we had the Constitutional Convention to create a country. We're part of the United States of America. I really don't look at my loyalty to Annapolis. I look at my loyalty to Washington, D.C. So I think that is an important distinction.
Washington, D.C. being an unincorporated state. But I'm going to pin you down further on this. I'm going to pin you down.
Last point, because I promised that the audience could ask.
Oh, yeah, because I'm going to pin you down further on this, because you admit, one of the things you do admit that in the book is that when communities encourage local spending and when people spend on local businesses, more of that money stays local. Right, that's one of the things you say is true, but you say, well, why should we take away? So why isn't it then legitimate for, a community to want to sort of defend itself from a foreign corporation like Walmart? Maybe you're going to say this is American, but maybe they consider it a foreign corporation in the sense that it's taking away money from its community and leaving us with a country which has many of the problems we have now, which is a great divide and a sense that in a sense that all the money goes to the coasts or a couple of really big companies, and yields to a lot of the sense of anger and economic displacement.
So the answer is a pretty clear one. Number one, it's a negative-sum game. So if every community behaved that way, net welfare would be lower because you're going away from what the market efficiency is. But the second point, and Tim, this is a really important point. You hit the nail right on the head of a very serious problem in the U.S. economy over the last 40 years, and that's whatever you want to call it, the hollowing out of the heartland, a lot of community distress, particularly rural communities, some of that big forces, but almost no federal or national policy to respond to that. And what I worry about is because we've been so lax on the right policies in so many areas, we just go, well, let's use antitrust, let's use banning Walmart. I would much rather see Congress, expand the funding of the Economic Development Administration to $1 billion or $2 billion a year, and move some of these big federal. Let's get the FBI fingerprint thing in West Virginia, which Byrd did. That was a great thing. So I don't disagree with the problem. I just disagree with the solution.
All right. Who has a question? And I will emphasize it must be a question. Okay, sir, the mic is coming your way.
Hi there. Thanks for the debate. Alex Stapp from the Niskanen Center. My question is about the healthcare industry. When we think about big pharma and big hospitals, how much of this is about government-granted monopoly versus natural monopolies? And how can we think about interventions, given those distinct situations?
It's both. The U.S. healthcare industry, I can't even work in that, do antitrust work because I get too upset about it. I was just reading this case that the FTC brought, Quest Corp case, where there was a company. This isn't about bigness, so sorry, but there was a company with a monopoly on the main drug used to treat infantile seizures. So, under the year of 2 fatal infantile seizures, and the company Quest Corp got control of the drug and began raising the prices. They were $40 a vial, and they were concerned that there was a competitor to it, and that the competitor would force them to lower their prices, so they bought the competitor, so now they control everything in monopoly fashion. So they raised the price from $40 to $34,000, so an 850% increase. And, whoever, obviously some children died, no question. Anyway, the point is so that's a combination. In that situation there, you have a problem of failures of antitrust enforcement, failures of some patent policy problems, a healthcare system where the overall the costs are not the people spending the money are not seeing the prices, or they see are not generally seeing the prices. And so this all combines to create this sort of perfect storm of the worst of government intervention and of capitalism run amok, where people seek tiny advantages in this complex structure, jack prices however they could do it. And there's anyone who says there's a simple solution like more antitrust enforcement is lying. Although I do think more antitrust enforcement could do it, but I've come to the opinion that there's just no hope. Even if you try antitrust enforcement, they'll turn to something else. We spend forever in the FTC working on pay for delay settlements, other things, and now the industry's moved to something else, rebates. And so I think you actually need to control costs. Need much more aggressive measures that just get directly into something that people are afraid of, which is price regulation. But I don't think we have any other way around it.
So perhaps not surprisingly, Tim and I have a different view generally, although we probably might agree with some local hospital mergers, too much power, although that's not my deep area by any stretch of the imagination. I am looking forward to when Amazon, Berkshire, and what's the big bank, J.P. Morgan, transform the healthcare industry, because I think it's an industry that has to have scale and networks effects. We're living in the guild era of the Middle Ages with our, my doctor's got him and her, and the most inefficient system in the world. So I'm looking forward to a big disruptor with some real technology and some real scale to shake this thing up and digitize it and all these other things. I'm really looking forward to the world where I can do my prescriptions on Amazon, because I got to tell you, getting prescriptions and figuring out where they are is a hassle. When you look at the evidence, though, Tim, healthcare costs, and I don't have this, my colleague Stephen Ezell leads our work in this area, knows this better than I do, but healthcare costs, the amount of it in the national economy made up by drug costs are quite small. And absolutely, there are some bad actors. Those get portrayed as if it's part of it. They're terrible companies that are just doing obscene things. They tend to be smaller companies. There's a good article in the Post last week on the case, a bunch of state AGs, you might have been involved in it, on generic price fixing. No excuse for that. They should be heavily prosecuted if you're in the generic sector and you're price fixing. But I think what we have to remember, one of the ways we're going to one of the ways we're going to improve healthcare outcomes and certainly reduce costs is through innovation. And the biopharma sector is the most innovative in the world, in the U.S. We're much more innovative than Europe, and one of the reasons we're more innovative is they use price controls in Europe. Companies cannot make any money, very much money in Europe. They don't reinvest it into drugs. If you look at the FDA numbers on what's called new NMEs, new molecular entities, it's going up every year for the last 6 years, Stephen, something like that. We're getting more and more new molecular entities, and not copycats, I should say. So we're really making progress on a really important set of physical and mental diseases. And then finally, when you look at profit rates, and we did a report on this called Life Sciences Politically Purple, we analyzed the literature on that. When you really look at profit rates in the pharmaceutical industry, the biopharmaceutical industry, they're not very much higher, especially in a risk-controlled, you control for risk and the time value of money. They're just not that much higher. They're maybe 2 or 3 percentage points higher than the average of overall profits. I'm not going to lose sleep over 2 or 3 percentage points if the cost of cracking down is going to be reduced investment in R&D. One last thing. The U.S. biopharma industry invests more in R&D as a share of sales than any other industry any place in the world. You take all the other biopharma industries all around the world, you take all the other industries in the U.S. and around the world, the U.S. life sciences industry invests more in R&D to solve diseases than any other industry. And that is principally because we don't impose price controls. So not to say we don't have a massive amount of things to do in healthcare reform, including access. I just don't see this as the path to get there.
Let's take another question. I have more to say about that, but I think we should see some questions. Hey.
Hi, Neil Chilson, Charles Koch Institute. So I was fascinated by your mention of Hayek and the Hayekian problem of a big organization not being able to make good decisions based on the information flows that are happening within it.
Right.
And you did mention that government has the same problem. That's what Hayek was originally talking about, this sort of central planning. So if a big organization can't make those decisions well, how can a government enforcer make decisions well about when to bring its enforcement actions or not? It surely faces similar, perhaps even worse, knowledge problems.
Yeah, I think everybody. So I'm of the opinion that everybody faces informational problems. That we're all sort of, we're overrated humans. We think we know stuff. We make mistakes all the time. I just think. So I do think all government enforcement will have a certain level of error, but that doesn't mean the right amount of enforcement is zero. And maybe that's the way of putting it. I wouldn't be the person to say when we were in the FTC or state AG we got everything right. In fact, we blew it on a lot of mergers that we should have blocked. But the idea that therefore, because government will also make errors, they should never do anything, that's also wrong. It's like saying companies shouldn't do anything because they'll make errors. I just think everyone should be aware that this is an error. And you do what you can to reduce the errors. One of the reasons I've been calling for more merger enforcement that comes later, or probationary periods on mergers, and so we'll have more information. So we haven't really talked about media that much, believe it or not. But if you think about the AT&T Time Warner merger, a lot of different opinions as to whether that would be anti-competitive or not. Vertical mergers are complicated. It's hard to know exactly. But I bet we'll know in 3 years whether, in fact, this was, as AT&T said, the beginnings of better competition in media, or whether it turns out to be, some kind of scheme to use HBO to boost prices to increase AT&T's subscriber base and hurt its competitors. I think we'll know that in a couple of years. Maybe we'll know that.
As an employee of AT&T, I fully support monopoly rents. And
oh, I forgot you. Yeah. So we'll know. Sorry, maybe I need some water. But I think that there's also ways of, when you have limited information, of trying to deal with that as well. And I think government should be doing that. In particular, in antitrust and merger review, we should be doing more and trying to get as much information before we make the big decisions.
Okay. Another question?
I'm Ira Gershkoff. My career has been in the beleaguered airline industry, which is actually no longer beleaguered. But I would like to offer a ridiculously simple solution to this dilemma. So all of us, when we make more money, we run the risk of going into a higher tax bracket. And that's not done for corporations for a very good reason, is that you don't want to disadvantage the capital just because they're a little bit bigger. So what I would say is for a company like, let's use Amazon as an example.
Is this going to be phrased in the form of a question?
Yeah.
Point? Great. So
so the idea is to for a company like Amazon, have beyond some certain level of profitability, increase the tax, and you can avoid the tax by breaking up voluntarily. So the question is, that's kind of what do you think of that idea, and has anybody suggested something like that?
I don't. So I'm not sure if I fully understand. So in other words, you have a graduated tax, so the more money
right.
you make,
so
you have
reach
incentives.
Beyond a certain level of market concentration, you pay a higher tax bracket. You have the option to break up on your own terms to avoid it, or pay it. And antitrust regulation, which basically don't work, you don't need to worry about. One way or another, you either get more revenue for the state to compensate for the monopolization, or like it with AT&T and Standard Oil, you have a very productive breakup.
Right. So there's certain things I like about it. I wrote a book called Curse of Bigness. Obviously, it's going to be insensitive to whether or not the bigness is efficient or not, which is one weakness. There may be, but if you take the point, or if it's very high and you think, well, there's going to be some point, it's sort of like the alternative minimum tax. There's some point which the scale cannot be justified, and then there's something to it. The other hesitation, obviously, is that most taxes end up being avoidable one way or another, and you don't know whether the breakup is real, and maybe it doesn't actually have the consequences you hope for. But I've never really read any proposal. Maybe I'm not a tax attorney that would use tax to try to get at structure before. So it's interesting to think about it.
We actually do have a graduated corporate tax rate. If you're a small corporation, in fact, all corporations, the first amount, I forget, it's in our book, are taxed at a significantly lower rate, which of course we call for abolishing that because we believe in size neutrality in all policies. I would be very skeptical of this because it would suggest, for example, in the case of a company, just to pick a company like Intel, clearly has market share. Some years it does pretty well. So in the years it does well, you'd basically be taking that money away, and then you wouldn't give it back to them in the years they don't do well, and they wouldn't have that money to reinvest. So I do think, and to be fair, certainly Mike and I are not saying that, hey, let's get rid of the Department of Justice. That's a great idea. No more monopoly, no more antitrust enforcement. We're not saying that. What we're saying is that we should, number one, stick with the consumer welfare standard as we've done, and number two, we should be alert. And there are cases where companies shouldn't be allowed to merge, and DOJ blocks it, and they block it for good reason. So I think I'm fine with the current regime we have. Maybe some tweaks around the edges here and there, but I don't think we need an overhaul.
We're almost to the end, so I'm going to reclaim my last minute and
Sure.
just, I think we didn't talk enough about the democracy implications
That's a good
of
point.
bigness that Tim really gets into, and so I wanted to just quickly bring one last thing that Rob mentioned earlier. What about the democracy problems that you described, Tim, cannot be solved by campaign finance reform that are inherent to very large companies being players in our...
Yeah, no, I think that campaign finance reform is, like consent decrees, something you mentioned sort of sounds very good in principle, but I think doesn't get at the root of the problem. The root of the problem, that Brandeis and Jefferson were concerned about was excessive private power, so much so at some point that the private power had the possibility of exceeding public power, and that the idea that the country is actually run by its citizens, a democracy, starts to eviscerate and or disappear. I think many people in Washington believe with some justification that what the majority wants is not actually what they get in many cases. In pharmaceuticals, I hate to pick on them, but it's a tough industry. I think, if you had a referendum, you said how many people would like, some control on drug costs, it'd probably pass 90% or something like that. But, no legislation like that is even plausible. Across the line, there's just many things that people want they don't feel they're getting. That doesn't feel like a democratic outcome. I also think that this is maybe more for outside the United States, although it could become a danger here. There are historic examples where private power becomes so concentrated, where you have the rise of extremist governments, and if industry decides it likes the government, likes the extremism, that is also proven a danger. The most obvious example of this is the German example in the 1930s, where the major German monopolists lent their support to the Third Reich and consolidated its hold on power. So I'm not suggesting we're here right now, but I do think that we always need to keep in mind something Bob Potofsky said, which is we need to ask whether over-monopolization is actually compatible with democracy. And, I don't think you can bring every case with that, but I think it should be in the back of our mind as we consider the kind of economic structure we live under.
So, I'm glad you brought up the Hitler one.
We could end on Nazis, or...
I want to keep going deeper into Nazis. Tim, the study you cite in your book was a U.S. Army study from 1946 or something like that, 47, where they claimed that Hitler was supported by corporations, big corporations, oligopolistic corporations. when you look at the literature, the scholarly historical literature in the last 20 years on Hitler and German big business, you find that is simply not the case. There's a very good book by a Yale historian, Henry Ashby Turner, his Oxford University Press book, German Big Business and the Rise of Hitler. He says, quote, in the early stages before their electoral breakthrough in the 1930s, the Nazis excited virtually no support and a good deal of hostility and suspicion among the business elite. The business community largely were supporting the sort of free market liberal parties in Germany. They hated Hitler. Now, after Hitler takes power, no business in their right mind is not going to support Hitler.
But that's the crucial problem right there. There's the problem. That's where people think is the problem. Sorry, and we can get into a long debate about the history of the Third Reich. But there's that moment right after Hitler is elected where he starts to waver, and then IG Farben. Anyway, this is what the contention is, and I'm not the only one who makes it.
I don't agree with that. I think the literature is very, very clear that the business community in Germany did everything possible to keep Hitler from power because they knew what was going to happen. But I think more importantly, you cite Jefferson and all. I mean, look, let's be real. Jefferson was an agricultural producer Republican. His ideal world was yeoman farmers and yeoman craftspeople. Look, if we want to go back to that, let's just go back before 1890 because we crossed the Rubicon on that 100 years ago. We're not going back to that. We're in an economy, unless you want to go back to something out of The Hobbit, where we just have large companies. Half American workers work for large companies, and then. Most importantly, do you honestly think? By the way, when you mentioned Americans would like lower prices, drug prices. Anybody here wouldn't like lower drug prices? Now, let me ask you something. Would you like lower drug prices if the result is that your children will not have as good life-saving medicines when they become adults? So that's a different question, because a lot of people then would go, wait a minute, I'm willing to pay a little bit more so that my kids can have better drugs. So, it's important how you frame these questions. And the last point I'll just make is, I don't think that in any world we live in, that if pharma, who's, the Pharmaceutical Trade Association, I don't know how many members they have, let's just say hypothetically they have 10 big members. If somehow we broke up all those 10 pharma companies, Lilly and Merck and all, now they have 20 big-ish members, that their political power would change one iota. Just not going to happen. Political power isn't related to firm size. It's related to the amount of money, partly related to the amount of money you can bring to the table, which is why campaign finance reform, and it's partly about how many grassroots you can mobilize. And it's there that, realtors, car dealers. Here's another good one, Tim. You know this because the New York Attorney General guy, not the Attorney General, the best guy in the country on the scam that optometrists are doing to keep consumers from buying their contact lenses. I was on a panel with him at the FTC, and he's been fighting that fight, the good fight, for a long time. You know who the bad guys are? It's the optometrists who have 5 employees. Who's the good guys? It's Walmart, because they're wanting to sell you lenses much more cheaply than the optometrists are. So I think this notion that somehow the big guys are anti-consumer and have the power, in the case of optometry, the small guys have most of the power.
So I have my last word. I won't, go line by line. I encourage people to read Dan Crane's study. There's a lot of studies of the Third Reich and the role of some of the large companies. It's not only the U.S. Army study, but we'll just leave that as disputed between us. But I do think, it's worth, without suggesting that we want to live in Jefferson's time, I think one of the differences between us, perhaps, is what we think matters. And I think people... You said, a lot of this fight is emotional. I think, people have a right in a democracy to decide what kind of country they want to live in. And, people may prefer a country with more local business, with smaller business, with less of a sense of powerlessness in the face of big business. And I think that that's one of the reasons this country passed the antitrust laws. And when it comes up, the American people have repeatedly reaffirmed that that's what they want. And I think we have some room to choose, and have chosen. And I think with all possibility, the Americans will continue to choose such a path in the future that resists sort of an ultimate, purely number-driven, big business style economy.
Thank you, guys. That was an excellent debate. Could have gone on for much longer. I'll remind everyone there are books for sale in the lobby.
I think we're signing as well.
And if you're signing as well,
Sure.
you can get your book signed when you buy it. Anything else? No, I think?
And I
Okay.
noticed that my book is small and your book is big.
As it should be. This is
Yes, it's very compact.
so much bigger.
Okay, excellent. Thank you,
Size
guys.
doesn't reflect quality in this case.
Good time. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.